Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's now 1 o'clock, so we'll get started. Just as we do, to let you know that we're recording this session this afternoon, and it will be available on our website afterwards for anyone who wants to see it again. Welcome to our Policy and Research webinar, and particular welcome to Professor Sharyn Rundle-Thiele, who'll be talking with us today about the 7-step co-design process. My name is James Zanotto. I'm the Director of Policy, Research and Communications here at LGBTIQ+ Health Australia, and my pronouns are he, him. LHA would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, their diversities, histories and knowledge, and their continuing connection to our land and community. We pay our respects to all First Nations people and to elders of past, present and future generations. I'm joining you today from the land of the Gundungurra people in the Southern Highlands in New South Wales. Please feel free to use the chat function to share where you are today. So before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping items. We're recording today. If you miss any information, you'll be able to see it again on our website in about a week's time. After the discussion, there'll be an opportunity for questions. I invite you to use the Q&A function, which for most Zoom users is located at the bottom of the screen. Please feel free to ask any questions at any time, and we'll come back to them after the discussion. And if anything in today's webinar raises concerns for you, support is available. You can contact QLive, which provides Australia-wide anonymous support for LGBTIQ communities after 3 p.m. each day on 1800 184 527 or visit qlife.org.au. So on that note, let's begin. Today we're exploring co-design. It's a concept used frequently across our health and well-being sector, sometimes without a clear understanding of what it is, how it's done, and its limits and constraints. This webinar is an opportunity to explore strategies of using co-design more effectively to improve outcomes for LGBTIQ+ health and well-being. Last year, I was in Adelaide for the Preventive Health Conference. I attended a session presented by Sharyn. I found it one of the most clear, practical and helpful presentations on co-design. And I was keen to share it with our members and partners. So I invited Sharyn to join us today. Professor Sharyn Rundle-Thiele applies marketing to improve people's health and well-being and to protect the planet. She founded social marketing at Griffith and co-founded the Journal of Social Marketing. She's Vice President of the International Social Marketing Association. Sharyn has co-designed behaviour change programs with community and stakeholders. Her projects deliver outcomes and impacts, including removing leaves from waterways, improved social connections for adolescents, reduced koala deaths from dog attacks by 40%, and reduced koala deaths from car strikes by 83% and more. She's an award-winning scientist and social marketer. Her work is published in more than 240 books, book chapters, and journal papers. So let's get started. A reminder on questions, post something in the Q&A and we'll come back to it after the discussion. And I'd like to hand across now to Sharyn. Thank you,
Hi,
Sharyn.
James. Thank you so much. And can you confirm you can see the screen?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Working well.
Excellent. Great to know that we're off and running. So my name is Sharyn. I've worked across the change space for quite some time now. And co-design for me is a process that ensures any voice is heard. I respect that all individuals are different and that we all come, each of us is like a book with a story to actually tell. So this is just a bit of an example of the science underpinning the work that we do. And for me, co-design starts with a blank sheet of paper, and it requires people to come together and agree on the path forward that would work for them and other people like them. So if it wasn't a blank sheet of paper, for me, it isn't co-design. I apply co-design to work with stakeholders, community. They might be in the same room, they might be in separate rooms, and I'll share a little bit of how we go about doing that with you today. The stakeholders can be involved at the start in terms of sourcing ideas, what approaches have worked effectively in the past, what ideas they might have that they would actually like to test. So they can be in that first section. And they can also be at the back in terms of reflecting for change. So if I work with community, stakeholders can be involved at this back end to tell me what's possible. What constraints would actually not make that what people actually tell me they need from happening. That red box in the middle is where the 90-minute co-design session happens. So this might involve, for me, typically if I'm out in person delivering these, about 25 to 30 people placed into small teams of 3 to 4 people. Those small teams get together and tell me what they would like to see that would work for them and other people like them. So we're just going to take a really quick look through the 7 steps today, and I thought that might be the best way to help you actually see. Resourcing and planning involves learning what's happened in the past, and so we might source things from the evidence base. You could be using government reports, whatever's around you. Asking people. So I call it expert interviews, but it's a case of simply jumping on the phone and saying, who do you know that's done something effective to tackle this issue before? Or we might survey the constituents that we're serving. So understanding where they're at, what they need, and what else they would like to see happening. That informs us about all the approaches that have been used in the past. And just to show you, it can kind of look a bit like this if it's a very systematic evidence review. And we talk to different types of people. So when I'm tackling koalas, I'll talk to conservationists. I talk to people who train dogs because dogs attack and kill koalas. I am not an environmental expert. I am not a health expert. What those experts teach me is approaches that have been used in the past. And so here are the ideas sourced from both evidence reviews and conversations with people to understand who has actually tried to tackle an issue like dogs attacking koalas before. Those cards that I showed you before were used in the sensitization phase. I try to approach people that haven't typically thought about the problem. So we put ads out to try and attract people into the room, and we're working with people who might not normally think about dog and koala attacks. And this is what they come up with. So you can see how they've cut a few ideas off those idea cards and put them onto the dog and koala harmony page. And people quite often ask me, if I give out those ideas, which I showed you before, does that actually influence what the designs or the ideas that people come up with? And the answer clearly is no, because if you look at the Koala Alert app that was first indicated back in 2016, it's got nothing to do with any of the other ideas that were previously tested. So the planning and resourcing stage is a very detailed process to figure out what's already happened in the past. And then we can take that insight that comes through those many designs, and I only showed you 2 of our dog and koala ones, and this delivers me the insight I need to actually build the behaviour change programs that I go on to do. So just to give you an example, the people in these community sessions, we did have 2 dog owners whose dogs had attacked and killed a koala, said to us they wanted a fun program with a wider wildlife focus that showed them what to do. And so the program that was born was called Leave It. It is a dog training program run over 4 weeks that aims to actually show dog owners how we can actually train an ability called wildlife aversion. To sell the whole program idea, we created a festival called Dogfest, and we didn't have any marketing budget for this. It was $60 that we used to put some flyers and leaflets out. Council supported us putting the message out, and we got out into community, and community did all of the talking for us. So for me, as we actually worked with co-design for the very first time, what I quickly came to understand was if you can give people what they want and need, they'll do the talking and the rest of the work for you. And because I do work in the space of behavioural change, understanding if it actually made a difference is really critical to what we do. And the abilities that you can actually see, because we measured more than just the ability to run away from a wildlife creature, aversion, We also measured sit, stay, and the other commands. But if you take a look here, you can see week 1 and where the dog was at the start and how it improves over time. So Leo was our biggest improver out of these 2 dogs for aversion. Leo actually learned a whole lot. All of that work is actually written up scientifically and demonstrated a proof of concept. Today, you can actually download a free app called Leave It in Google Play or iTunes and get help if you actually happen to have a dog that needs a bit of training help. So the jobs that we have to do to actually get there, as I said before, get out there and figure out what's been done in the past, understand who else you want to be working with and through. Now, for me, when I'm trying to target certain populations like LGBTIQ+, I will work with social groups who are already representing them and other service agencies to figure out how and who, and then quite often we will recruit people into the team so that we're actually having conversations with like people. So just to give you a sense, that's some of the planning that has to actually kick in. Where possible, we give incentives because we're trying to attract people that don't normally think about this. I appreciate that sometimes that ability. So just make sure that you make people comfortable. Give them refreshments, a nice experience with a nice room. Whatever's possible is how we sort of try to approach it. So that's some of the examples of what we start to build together. And what I give you here is a bit of a checklist of the questions that we actually ask and the things that we start to source to set up the room. But if I ever put you into training, I'll give you the depth and really teach you how to do it. Step 3, we've got to recruit people to get those 25 to 30 people in the room. So we have to know who, how, and where we're actually going to get them. And here is a couple of examples of work where we were working on youth violence, sexual abuse prevention, and the ways that we actually reached out into community to get carers, young people, other people working with these people to ask them what would work for them and other people like them to prevent. This example here shows you how much and how important recruitment can be and how targeted it can actually be, because we're not all the same. So if we know and we've got some segments or personas built, we can actually deliberatively recruit for that just by asking people at the point that they screen a range of questions. And it's a bit like a Harry Potter sorting hat moment where you can actually move people into various groups, like with their own type, and you can actually learn what each different group actually needs. And the power of this is phenomenal. So this is a project from Energy Queensland that my team ran back in 2020, and take a look at how you can start to heat map the ideas across different group types to understand what's common, or importantly, what's different, because not everyone's the same. Different groups need different things. The more we can reach across the more things, and obviously budgets come in the way here, the better the outcomes can actually be. So the recruitment part is really important in terms of figuring out who is going to be in the room. And you can sort them by putting the same types at the same tables, the same types in the same meetings, or you can mix it right up because you actually just want to get different types of people together. That comes down to your project, your needs, what's actually going to work. The sensitization point is the moment you've got your people in the room. You spend a half an hour just warming people up. Recall that I said I don't always get people in the room who always think about this. So to get them thinking about it, I might give them a couple of fun tasks, or I do a bit of basic market research saying, hey, what do you like about this idea? And in doing so, you're warming them up without them realizing. And importantly, you're teaching them to have voice, like every voice matters. And this process is all about making sure everyone contributes equally. So sensitization is a really important part of the process, just to get people feeling comfortable and confident and ready to share. And then the magic starts to happen. Like through really effective facilitation, you start to navigate at times difficult conversations. The facilitator is usually very quiet. They set ground rules. They're making sure that every voice is actually heard. And if you've got dominant voices, they shut them down. So they have to work hard to make sure everyone actually has something to actually say. So if you felt you weren't strong at facilitation, you know someone else who's very good at it, I'd recommend while you build up your skills in this space, if you know you're working in something contested, make sure you've got strength in the room. I have had moments where it's like fireworks go off. So we've gone into the room and actually come out with some designs, and I'm going to show you a couple of designs really shortly from an online session that we actually ran. This session, we've got our ideas, people have pitched their solutions to us, and every solution looks different. It delivers some slightly messy data. And so at the back end, you've got your data, you've finished all your co-design sessions, and you're pretty much left with one really important question: where do we start? And like I said, that data, it's a little bit messy. It doesn't come out looking the same. So here's an example. I showed you two paper versions before of pictures, what people had actually drawn for us, and then they stand there for 2 minutes and talk about it. They give it life, and you have a transcript around that. This is an online example, and this is from my Leaf Collective project, where members of community were basically challenged with, how do we pick up leaves out of gutters and drains? Not something people normally thought about. Most of us didn't know that leaves were litter. So how do I take that data and where do I figure out how to start? What I basically do is if you go back and look at that first one, is we pluck out the ideas that start to look the same. It won't be word perfect. As I said, this data is slightly messy, but you can see two vague ideas starting to come through here of, let's leverage what's already in community, coalition, NGOs that are already working together, with someone else talking about networks and how there are actually things available in community. That little bit alone was critical in how we went on to actually name the particular pilot project we were working on, the Leaf Collective. Let's work with whoever's working in this area already and share what they're up to and leverage from there. And this shows you how I organize my data. So I take it, figure out what's coming up the most. And so you can see how I've just put a bit of a simple content count analysis into play to actually get a long list of ideas. And again, it's all about where can I actually start? So many ideas given to me, more than we can possibly actually enact. And that's the challenge of co-design. It is a process where people in the room hear it, they get taken on a journey, and having run Leave It and Dogfest and being there from the co-design point right through to today, 2024, we have members of community who walked up to us and said, we can't believe you made this happen. So the power of listening to people and then trying to mobilize around what they want, I cannot speak to it highly enough. So here's some of the ideas that we've actually tested across the Leaf Collective. We've had an opportunity to do 3 different 6-week trials, and people had said they didn't know leaves were litter. They wanted incentives. They wanted to be shown what to do. And here's some of the many ideas that have sort of popped up. And we've been fortunate enough that we've been able to test some. So not all, but we're in the process of actually, like, every trial or campaign opportunity we get, we've been out there testing some of the ideas. All the ideas that work, we've kept there. And this just shows you a little bit of what's going on. Free leaf bags are the incentives that we give away, and have a look at how that's grown over time as we've learned, grown stronger, and been able to do it even better. We've convinced people in community to adopt trees and drains. They've shared their photos and stories and given them back to us. And we've talked about those through our social media sort of sites, the website, and more. So you can see how it's all changed over time. And as I said earlier, I have behaviour change as the core DNA of what I usually do. And so we're all about understanding, are we actually making changes in people's behaviours, hearts, minds? And so here you can see how we do that. We get control groups and we test. Are the people inside our testing group doing something more or less? Sometimes we do want them to stay the same. And so we're always looking at that to understand how well a campaign might actually be performing. So there's a lot more for us to test and do, but my absolute advice in terms of co-design is, if you can be game enough to work with the community with a blank sheet of paper and say, what else do we need to do? I've learned a long time ago that we need to do something new and different that we haven't done before, because that's why our gaps aren't closing. And my heart is all about, can we actually close these gaps? Can we make the world a better place for the underserved, the people who are not getting what we need? And what I'd like to share with you is some of the kits and the other things that people have reported to me that they find super helpful. So if you're new to design and you want to start making a step into this space, These are some of the resource kits that have been really strongly recommended, that people are finding super helpful for them, because we are all trained differently. And finding something that talks to you and is working for you is really super critical. You can learn more and partner and network with us via our annual event, Change. This is a 2-day event where we offer both workshops and TED-style talks. But importantly, if you're interested in learning more about co-design, in April, we have an online how to facilitate co-design online. And we also have sessions in Sydney and Brisbane in person. So you can learn how to actually facilitate and do co-designing in person. One of my past participants said to me, as she wrote out, and she just recently run a course on vaping, that she really has walked away with an understanding of how to implement the 7 steps. And if I have one heart, it's to hand this ability out to more people, because it makes my day when someone writes in and says, I can now do co-design, and my community and the people around me were thrilled. It's a great process. It's half the reason I sort of came in to join today. So James, thanks for inviting me in. And for everyone, I look forward to any questions. And importantly, that's my email to reach out to me at any time. So I'll help with all that I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharyn. That was a very, very quick run through for us there today. So I'd like to add to Sharyn's invitation. If you have any questions about the 7-step process that you'd like to ask her, but I'd like to start with a first question, if I could, Sharyn, and that's to perhaps bring it home for us here in the room as people who are in LGBTIQ plus community controlled organisations or working with LGBTIQ plus communities. How do you see this process could benefit community controlled organisations working in that health and well-being space with LGBTIQ plus people?
That's a great question, James. For me, co-design brings other voices into the conversation. We often find that we're operating with a lot of assumptions. We've got our own biases. And there are also, even within some organisations, whether it be community or mainstream, very loud voices that are always heard, and many other voices that are never heard. And for me, the power of co-design is changing the conversation and opening up to different ideas that we might be missing. And so in study after study, as we've been using this process everywhere, I'm estimating we're right about 50% of the time. So coming at it with a true open mind of how else and what is it that other people need, to me is a very important part about how we're actually going to find the path forward.
So I guess on that, one of the other things that interests me is while many of us here are LGBTIQ plus community controlled organisations, some of our member organisations are mainstream organisations, so they have a program working with LGBTIQ plus people, and so partners and allies, not necessarily people directly within community, are important. When you're working with co-design and you're gathering the group of people you co-design with, what would you see as the important role for allies and broader groups of people?
Quite often with allies, one of the ways that I plan co-design is to have allies involved in the co-design process with me. And we have the small group teams that come up with designs. And this is where we would have LGBTIQ plus people designing. And we would have an ally sitting there with a very explicit brief that their job is to listen and take notes. And potentially they're also there to present an idea at the back end or later on comment. It is one way of making sure that we're getting the right voices speaking more and allowing everyone to hear that conversation together. And where else they're actually critical is at that fuzzy back end. And potentially at the front planning end, because that's the moment where we're having conversations about, is this practical and feasible? And if it's not, why not? And what else can we actually potentially be doing about it? Or how can we start to resource it to make it happen? Because the very fact that it's not there yet says something something's missing, and how do we shape that conversation? So it does enable a bit of advocacy work, but it certainly is, as a process, is very capable of changing a lot of hearts and minds in the way that perhaps previously they hadn't thought of.
Thanks. We've got an interesting question in the chat from Lana as well. Does your approach to co-design differ when working directly with young people, 12 to 25-year-olds?
A great question, Lana. We did a bunch of work on youth violence, sexual abuse prevention, also vaping, alcohol use. There's many different times we've been targeting people across those age ranges. And there's not a lot of differences in terms of the actual 90-minute process as we run it. Where differences start to come in is if we've got very socially disadvantaged people, someone who can't write. We've had people who are blind, and therefore I've got to change the approach I use. We cope with that by understanding a lot about the people before they come in and make sure we have a matching person next to them who can speak for them, that we've got a translator in situations where we need translation. And we might change the task ever so slightly, but in short, most of the time our work, we're operating, talking to people as though they have about a year 6 level of understanding, regardless of the projects we're actually running. So we've tried to keep it very much framed in a way that everyday Australians can participate. And the only adaptation that I sometimes have to make with young people is that if they're in their own social peer groups, they might not want to present publicly, and therefore we adapt how we do the pitch task, because usually we ask each group to stand up and do that. But sometimes we end up in a situation with adolescents where they're not comfortable to do so. They feel a bit threatened. And so we'll just adapt some of the techniques a little bit for those reasons. Like, we don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable. We can record the whole conversation and we can still understand what was actually meant, rather than having them sort of step up feeling discomfort. So they're just some of the different ways. And we have a whole host of different sensitization tasks that we use, so that if we know we've got a situation where people are going to be really quiet and it's going to take a little while, we put them into the driver's seat. But essentially for people in the room for 90 minutes, the time flies, they're busy, they're happy, they're laughing, and you've succeeded in co-design when they don't want to leave the session, and that you've got a room booking or you're trying to back up into the next one. You've got to give yourself space to let them stop and chat, because that's how much people get into the process. They're not ready to just disappear and leave unless it's a school group that has to be on a bus.
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks in the chat from Lana as well. We've still got a bit of time for some more questions. If anyone has questions they'd like to ask Sharon before we finish up. At the moment, Sharon, another one from me. I'm interested in knowing when you think co-design is not appropriate. And I think in the back of my mind, I'm aware that so many funding projects and grants and programs that we work with, they come with a lot of guidelines and expectations around outcomes that can really run counter to your start with an open slate approach. How do you manage those situations, and are there times when you choose not to do co-design?
I would like to see our funding agencies get better at having tender processes or guidelines in their processes that make it really clear that we're going to apply authentic co-design, and none of us could really, unless we've already run the work, predict what the outcomes are actually going to be. But unfortunately, the process of how our funding's allocated still doesn't look like that. So that's my North Star dream spot I hope we get to one day. I think we'll get there as more people get comfortable with what co-design is capable of doing. And again, with the true heart of, are we ever going to close some of these health issues we're dealing with or change the gaps? We really need to keep mixing up the way we actually approach it. So there is a lot that we're dealing with co-design because it is fuzzy. In a project I'm currently working on with Asthma Australia, they had specific we're going to do a webinar or do a something, but realistically they were actually co-designing the process. And what if a webinar wasn't indicated. We've been dealing with all of those problems. So trying to write things loosely at project start gives a bit of flexibility for enabling adaptation based on what comes in. Another real challenge I've hit is, oh, no, it has to be evidence-based. What if it doesn't exist already? So I don't really have a full answer for that one either, other than maybe there are elements of an evidence-based program that can still be drawn upon that are indicated. But we have to get better at sometimes acknowledging we might have just fully missed the mark. So I hope, James, that's answered the full question, because it's a complex one that you threw at me.
I think we've got a question in the chat at the moment from Lemon, which I think is somewhat associated. What about co-design with or without joint decision making? Now, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, so
Yeah, Lemon,
certainly,
if I don't answer this in your frame, just reframe it and put it at me. But one of the true sort of a focus of co-design is to make sure that the voices that aren't usually heard are now part of the conversation. And so my experience sometimes with that is overcoming some expert bias can be a real challenge, because there are people who've been dedicated to it, working on it for years, and they just think they know best, but they don't, because otherwise we would have closed the gaps already. So if we can start to lean into co-design more, to appreciate, I'm the first to tell you, as I'm not the health expert or environmental expert, we don't want an unintended outcome. But at the same time, we need to open up and actually appreciate it might be that we've still missed the mark, and that to get the intended outcomes or the positive change we want to see, we need to be better at meeting people where they're at. And so I think that still is some of the challenge of our whole system here, as we're trying to push for both system level change and also put these all voices to being heard at the start of what we do, because I think the way we've structured some of the system at the moment isn't doing that well. So great examples I've seen are having both consumer advisory committees or consumer-led approaches that then also have the stakeholders at the back end telling us and ensuring there's no unintended consequences coming forward. So that's sort of some of the way to manage the process, and why the 7-step co-design sort of sits there with 2 circles at the start with the bit happening in the middle, because that to me is the version of joint decision making that's happening. Because if it doesn't have stakeholder support, it won't matter what the voices have told us in co-design, it's not going to happen. And getting that stakeholder support is critical. So if we can put them in the room, get people hearing it to change hearts and minds of stakeholders, that can actually help get what community is telling us they need to see happen.
thank you, Sharyn. There's still a few more minutes for any other questions, if there are other questions people would like to ask. I'm going to ask another one then, Sharyn, in the absence of anything in the chat at the moment. I've in the past heard people talk about co-design very much as a cyclical approach, where you keep going back to your people again and again until the layers are built up and it's quite clear where the outcomes are. Your approach is much more linear in some ways, and doesn't build up very much in layers. So 2 questions really. Have you had experiences where you get to the end of the process and people are not happy with the outcomes? And if you do, how do you bring people back in for that next layer of what's actually often a cyclical process?
It's a really great point, James. I think the biggest challenge I face is if you ask me to step out and work into a community, I get feedback saying, is this another talk fest? My approach is to get co-design into action, take something from it and make something happen and keep talking about it. It might not be perfect first time. It so happened that Dogfest was an absolute hit and 1,500 people came with that $60 budget. We filled training programs and we got great outcomes. We are yet to have applied and put co-design into process and not get an outcome that's positive. We won't get it perfect. Like someone will send us a letter telling us they hate the approach, or someone else will do that. But my own marketing training tells me you're never going to satisfy 100%, but if you're getting to 90%, you're doing a great job. So I love to be able to get in and move. And the layering I love to do is to start to scale up, sustain, and roll things out. So how Leave It evolved after that first little tiny pilot was that we actually started training the dog community, the dog training community. And so could we empower and embed skills into that community that, you know, years later you could still see were actually left there? So it's not always about us and being there. It's trying to figure out how to get the redundancies and build things that can last, and can we get out and walk away? And I think mine is a heart when I am working sometimes on change. I see a lot of people wanting to own things, and I think that's preventing sometimes what we actually need to really be doing from actually happening. So we can talk and we can think and we can plan as much as we like, but the reality is we have to turn those behaviors off and have more of the actual doing behaviors that are supporting people with what they need, where and when they need it. And if our focus was and the energy was over there, I think we'd be seeing a lot more change happen a lot quicker.
Thank you, Sharyn. Certainly appreciate that. Was an insightful response to a complex question.
Yeah.
We don't at this stage have any further questions, so I think we might wind up today's webinar. So very much thank you again, Sharyn, for joining us. I really appreciate your time and sharing your 7-step approach to co-design with us. We have a survey which regularly we ask people after each of the webinars to fill out. So I'm going to drop the link for that into our chat at the moment. I've been so busy asking questions, I forgot to add it in. So just give me a moment. So the link's in the chat. Everyone should also get it after they finish up in the webinar today. So I'd certainly welcome your feedback. And thank you, Sharyn, and thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good day and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Yeah, thanks
Bye,
all.
everyone.
Thanks for having me, James. Bye.